So, good morning, everybody. This is another one of our educational learning sessions on a particular topic. This morning's topic is the Goldacre report, as you'll see on the screens. This is a report which came out fairly recently, which does have some fairly significant impacts on the way our patient data is used for research. And what we'll do this morning is just go through probably about 20 minutes, just going through some of the key things, which hopefully will be helpful and indeed might open up some questions. At any point, if anybody's got any questions, either shout or wave or put them in the chat, and we'll pick those up as we go along. We've also got time at the end, plenty of time for questions or discussions or anything else that people want to raise as well. So first of all, my name is Chris Carrigan. I'm the expert data advisor to Use My Data. And I'll be taking you through the slides this morning. So, first of all, well, what is the Goldacre report? What's it about? Why is it so interesting? Why are we focusing our time on this? So, first of all, just let somebody else in. So, first of all, it was a review which was commissioned by the Secretary of State, and the concept of the review was: how do we provide better, broader, safer processes to use health data for research and planning. It was commissioned directly by the Secretary of State, and it was an odd way it was commissioned in a way. We've seen reviews done before, and it's been done through quite a formal route through the civil service. This one was commissioned to slightly differently, and it was to look at some of the key problems around data, and particularly data available for research. So I paraphrased some of the words from the original briefing, but essentially health data is all over the place. It's in lots of different places. The data access, the steps researchers have to get through to get access to data to undertake their research, I think is getting worse. It's never been great. And I think in the past few years, with various things going on around concerns around data access, and in particular, organizational changes where the large data providers, the data controllers, have actually changed and merged. And I think that's had a significantly detrimental effect on data access for research. So it needed to look at that. The whole area around transparency and consistency of data usage, which is really poor. There's little transparency in many areas around how our data is used, who by, and what for. The report also needs to look at who is using the data. Do we have the right people across the NHS to make sense of the data? And how do we improve this? So we know lots of good research and data and analysis goes on at the minute, but how do we improve that? How do we make it much bigger, much more scalable, much more robust, and do it in a way which people still find trustworthy and open? And around that, what behaviours need to change across the domain? So a fairly wide-ranging set of things that the review need to look at. And it was particularly commissioned to inform the new NHS data strategy, which hasn't been published yet. A draft strategy was issued last year, and we responded to that from Use My Data. And when you get the slides afterwards, you'll be able to click on that and you can see the link. And we also input the Goldacre review itself. And again, you can click on that link to see what we submitted. Just in terms of the Goldacre review, it was named after Ben Goldacre, a surprise, a very smart guy based at the University of Oxford. Some of you will recognize his name from things like the Open Safely and Open Prescribing tools, systems and tools which use huge amounts of health data, de-identified health data, to look at a range of conditions around safe prescribing and safe use of NHS services. He's also a recognized author. He's produced lots of books. The most notable two that people may recognize are one called Bad Science, the other one called Bad Pharma. So Ben is a fairly high profile person in lots of areas, openly in terms of publishing, in the scientific community as well, and indeed based at University of Oxford and the Big Data Institute. So quite well placed to look at problems such as this. So without going into all the details of the Goldacre report, here's my summary of what it says in brief. So if you want to take one slide away, this is probably the more useful slide, although there's one at the end I think you'll need as well. Essentially what he said was, we need safer ways to manage health data, to make it available to researchers in a much safer and much more robust manner. And for each of these points, I've got a slide which I'll go through in a second. The issue of sharing and reproducibility. If one research group produces a report, it's very difficult for another group to test it, to reproduce it, because the data to do that sits in one place and isn't available elsewhere. Equally, the scientific methods, the tools, the computing code that one group will use to do their reports, again, isn't available to another group to pick up and test very easily. So there's a key point about sharing and reproducibility by using modern technology, modern methods, which are much more established across other areas, but less so in health across the NHS. Then there's around consistency and duplication, this thing called data curation, which I'll talk about separately. Data curation, if you imagine it, use the word data quality. That's probably a good analogy in this instance. So data curation is growing in its significance, it's growing in recognition, which is a real positive thing. I've got a separate slide on that. So key areas about making sure the data is correct and is accurate before you start doing your research on it. A fourth area is around skills. Do we have the right skills in the NHS, the data analysts? Are they in the right place? Are they supported? And there's a set of recommendations around that to improve the NHS's own internal analytical skills. Some of you will be aware of the amount of money the NHS pays to external organisations, external companies and consultancies to do the data analytics to push the results back into the NHS. And there is a question about whether the NHS is better doing some of those things themselves and what does it need. And the fifth point, the key point, is around governance. If we're going to improve data usage for research, then we also need to improve governance. We need to recognise where the hurdles and where the barriers are, and what we need to do to improve them. So there's a set of recommendations to improve the approvals process by which a researcher can get access to the data to undertake the work, and indeed looking at where the hurdles and where rules might need to change as well. It's worth noting that there are 3 documents which were published for the review. They total 136 pages, and there are 185 recommendations in there. This is a fairly chunky piece of work which was done, and I think I've even got pictures of them. 3 separate reports you can download. There's an executive summary, summary of findings, and a full report. They're worth looking at if you've got the time, but this is not an easy read, as you'll see in a minute. So just to pick up on the first point, trusted research environments. Now, within Use My Data, we've done a fair amount of work on trusted research environments, from webinars and other things on them. And the Goldacre report highlights that trusted research environments are a much better way of undertaking research than traditional data releases. So if I'm a researcher based in the University of Leeds, for instance, and I want to undertake a piece of work, I can build my research proposal, I can go through ethics, I can get approvals in place, go through all the different steps. And then at the end of that, if I get the approvals and the permissions, traditionally the data would have been sent to me to store in the University of Leeds on a secure server within Leeds, which needs people to run it, people to secure it, various audits need to take place. So that's a cost to me in Leeds. It also means that once the data has left the data controlling body, it sits in Leeds, and the data controller doesn't really have any, the people who issue the data don't really have any sight of what's happening with the data in that other organization. Now, if you multiply that by 10, 15, 120, 2,000, for the sort of organizations that might want the same types of data, all of a sudden you've got one copy of data which might exist in hundreds of different places. And it's impossible to keep track of what's happening in those hundreds of different places. So what TREs do is they take the opposite approach. They say the data will sit in the one place, this trusted research environment, a big tech box with lots of different controls around it, lots of different tools and services which you can use, but in one place. And the researcher is given access to log into that from Leeds or Oxford or wherever to undertake their research on the data. Everybody uses the same data. They all work in the same environment. The people who control the data, the national data controllers, can see who's accessing the data. They can restrict what they're doing with it. They can potentially immediately disable it at a moment's notice if they think something's going wrong. And everything becomes much more auditable, much more trustworthy, and much more open in terms of what the data's been used for. There are no surprises there. You're not giving data away, you're maintaining it within a central area so you can see what's going on. Now that should significantly reduce the worry factor of an organization just being given data to do things with. So that's why trusted research environments are a much more robust, very resilient, and a far better way to undertake research across the NHS. Then there's a question about, okay, how many of these have we got? So some of you will have come across trusted research environments in your day-to-day work around health data. There are some which already exist. There's a really bit of a concern about how many of these get built. So for instance, if you're just going to replicate 500 data releases with 500 TREs, well, what's the point? So the report does pick up and say, we actually only need to build a very small number of NHS analytical platforms, small number of TREs. That might be a challenge for some because historically the possession of data has been power. So there may be some pushback on that. But I think, again, that makes good sense. How many a small number is, I don't know. But I think that's where we need an open conversation about what the benefits are and how many we really do need. The benefit of trusted research environments should also be that we could accelerate the process of access for researchers. So because you're reducing or eliminating the risk of giving data away, then in theory, the access process should be much simpler because you can see who's doing what at all times. And you can publish all the different activity, what's going on. So those things are picked up in the report as well. It mentions one thing particularly around GP data. Now, we know there's been a lot of talk in the past about GP data and the government wanting to bring the GP data into a central system to analyze it with hospital data. And it does make some considerations of that, although I don't think it really says what the answer is, but it's a real push to move from pseudonymized or de-identified data to re-identifiable data to de-identified data. But I think there's a bit of confusion in there about what that's actually going to mean in practice, and we'll come to the last couple of slides will mention what that means. But essentially, TREs, trusted research environments, can be used to drive collaboration, drive modern approaches, because everybody's working in the same place, the same physical platform. It becomes much easier for researchers across different institutions to collaborate. It also becomes much easier to share share tech, the code, the technologies, the rules that are being used to undertake one piece of research, and they can be used elsewhere. So that's why TREs are so significant. Part of the benefit of TREs is that it enables you to share methods, share code. So when a researcher gets a data extract, they will write computer code to turn it into something which can be much more easily analyzed. So health data is messy, and to turn the health data into something which you can use on a big spreadsheet, for instance, you need to write a fair amount of computer code. There's complex things to turn it into sensible analytical pieces of data. Now, traditionally, that's never been shared. It's always sat within an individual institution. And one of the real pluses of the Goldacre report is it pushes the fact that that should be shared. And all those data, all those codes, all the work that's gone in should be reusable by others. So you can stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before. You don't have to reinvent things. That's a significant step forward. It sounds sensible, but it doesn't happen at the minute. And that also allows you to reproduce various different analytical pathways. You can reproduce work that's already been done and test it, peer review it much more easily. The other benefit is, as in the report, it says you need to generate an open library for all this code. So make it available to anybody who wants to use it. If it's funded by us, that should be usable by anybody. This is sharing the code and not sharing the data. Just remember. There's a theme which runs through the report in several areas, which talks about bringing together different disciplines. So a clinical expertise with an analytical expertise, with software development expertise, the real focus on bringing those different skill sets together, because one won't work without the other. And similarly, highlighting that where we need to work between industry and academia, between universities and commercial companies, we need to do that where it's helpful. So I think that's quite a positive set of statements around that. I mentioned data curation at the start. The phrase data curation is a bit confusing. It's not awfully well used in normal language. I would just say data curation is around data cleaning and data quality. So anybody who's been involved with a research project will know the first thing that the research team have to do is spend months and months and months doing data cleaning, and then they can undertake their research. So that's essentially what data curation is in this context. Now, you can imagine the amount of effort that goes on across 200 different research teams, cleaning the same data in their own institution for them to do their own research. Now, if that data cleaning could be done centrally and more collectively, then everybody would benefit. And that's a very simple concept that's embedded within the report. So standardizing the way data gets cleaned and making that cleaning mechanism available for everybody to use rather than having to be reinvented. You can do that with various different methods, various different technological tools, which are pretty standard across different industries now. So this is not new. This is not rocket science. It's basically just a different way of working and taking advantage of the fact you've got trusted research environments available. Go back to my previous thing about how many TREs, how many environments. If you have lots and lots of them, then inevitably these methods, tools might be more difficult to share. If you've got fewer TREs, they're probably more easy to share. So there's a whole range of things to consider about how many TREs we actually need. But a real focus within the report on sharing the code for curation, the code and the documentation that people generate, that could be a significant step forward. Then it talks about the analytical workforce. So it does recognize that we've got across the NHS, there's loads and loads, there's a large number of highly skilled NHS analysts who know how to work with the data, who know its complexity, who know some of the difficulties and the pitfalls within NHS data. Is a complex beast. But what the report recognizes and recommends is we need to create something which binds those people together, either with leadership and particularly with career progression, which is not awfully easy in the analytical space. If you're a researcher, you've got a clear research, professional research development path. For analytical people, that's less so. I know analysts who in the past have felt obliged to move into the research space because it was the only way they could develop their career. And I think what the report picks up on is something very positive that says we need to support the analysts who do the number crunching, that support the NHS rather than just producing high profile research reports. And then there's a point about the training that's needed, training researchers and analysts in lots of areas around computational data science. The new methods for working with data, big data requires different analytical computational techniques to work with it. Those need to be embedded across the NHS. So there's some real emphasis on investing in the analytical workforce we've got to make better use of it. I think that's a very positive thing. Then there's a point about a simplified approvals process. So I mentioned before the amount of time it takes for a researcher to get access to the data. If you want some examples, there are several examples within the larger of the three reports which highlight specific research programs which were either stopped or abandoned or delayed for significant amounts of time because of difficulty in getting through the approvals process to get access to the data, to be given the data. And that absolutely needs to be simplified and standardized and made much more robust, much more rapid rather, to eliminate some of these unnecessary delays to research. So there's a whole set of recommendations in the report around rationalizing those approvals process, which do include mentions of patient involvement. I'll come to that in the next few slides. And also mentions an open dialogue on commercial use of NHS data. So commercial use of NHS data is something we've covered in Use My Data before, but I think it's a significant area of increased interest. So if you look at the recent publications around the GPDPR, the GP Data for Planning and Research, there were lots of commitments around that data will never be available unless under strict conditions. And nobody really has had the conversation about, well, does that mean a commercial organization will be able to use it and under what conditions? So the report positively says we need that dialogue to take place. Commercial users will work with the NHS and will need to use some of this data, but there's a question about how does that fit with the TRE space? The bit in underline is a bit I don't agree with, because it says we need an open dialogue on commercial use of NHS data, but only after the privacy issues addressed by the TREs. Now, I think that's, for me, the wrong approach. We've said for a long time that the best time to involve people is at the outset. Involve them in understanding what the problems are, not how you think you're going to solve the problems afterwards. So I think that's missed a point about the need to get engagement and involvement right at the outset. All these problems of all the definitional stuff, all the decisions that get made, we need to be in there on the ground at the outset. So I would push back against that. Certainly the positive bits that the report picks up on, making rules around who can use patient records, particularly for running the NHS. So if you look at something like the National Data Opt-out in England, which talks about you you prefer not for your data not to be used for planning and research outside of your direct care. Well, planning and research are two separate things. Planning essentially helps run the NHS. Research helps develop new insights. So it does highlight that we need to get some new rules around how we use data for the running of the NHS, which is often very difficult and often confusing and not awfully clear either at the minute. And one final point I just picked up on from this section in the report was the problem about data controllership. So the people who manage, who own the data are called the data controllers. They're the ones who are legally responsible for making sure that no harm comes because of the data, and also that people who need to use the data are using it in the appropriate way. That's a data controller role. And it puts a little statement in the report that says, well, why don't we have one national data controller? In fact, that is the statement. I think this is pretty radical. Whether this will happen or not, I don't know. But it highlights to say, we've got 160 trusts, we've got 6,500 GPs, all acting as separate data controllers. So it's very difficult to get consistency across that. Also difficult for those organizations to play a true, active and effective role by being proper, well-educated, well-informed data controllers doing a job properly. And if an organization is relatively small, they may not have those skills. And if they don't have those skills, then inevitably they may be a bit more risk averse, and therefore data may not be used in the way it perhaps should be used. So there's an interesting discussion to be had around this, whether you need a single central data controller or an approvals mechanism, which is very radically different from one we've got at the minute. So I think there's absolutely a significant discussion to be had around that. And I think if that's going to be had, we need to play our roles in our views, getting our views in that as well. And then talking about the roles of patients and the public, the bit in quotations is directly from the report. Exploration of PPIE, patient public involvement and engagement, that's the acronym, sorry, was not a specific request in terms of reference for this review, nor does the team claim to be experts in the domain. So I'm glad that they've recognized that they're not the experts. I think it's very positive they've specifically said that. But not to embed the PPIE, the patient involvement, as a topic in this, I think it was a mistake, and I can't figure out really why that was the case. It does highlight in the report some areas, I think what we would call basic principles, ensuring patient involvement is done systematically and robustly at a national level on some of the large recurring questions. It also talks about some local needs as well, but doesn't really go into what that means. Now, for Use My Data, for us, that's quite significant because we do operate at local, national level, locally through all of you, nationally through all the work we collate to push into national consultations and lobbying and other things. So that's a direct impact, a direct question around what's our role in this. Very unclear within the report. And it talks about moving beyond communications and engagement to transparency and actions, again, without many actions being really defined. So I think I use the word modest recommendations. In fact, the word modest is used within the report about scoping its recommendations around patient involvement. So interested then, if you look at the patient involvement side and look at what's in the report generally, how does it map onto some of the things we've said? So the things that we all said around trusted research environments in the responses we put together in various webinars we've had, how does the Goldacre report map onto what we said? Well, it does highlight that health data needs to be used more effectively to drive research and save lives. So I think it's a really positive thing. It says right from the outset that health data is there not just to be collected, not just as a stamp collection, not just to sit in a box, but actually to be used. That's a real positive statement. So that's what, and again, I think that's what drives Ben Goldacre personally anyway. It highlights that there are unreasonable barriers to data for research. They're slow, it's confusing, it's inconsistent, and it's over complex in many, many different areas. You just need to talk to any researcher who's made an application to data, and I suspect they would say the same thing. And TREs have to play a critical role to address this. Now, that's something we've said for a long time, and so all those points are actually picked up within the Goldacre review. So that's positive, I think. We've also said for some time that risk-averse behaviours by the data controlling bodies must be overcome. We need to move from a guardianship to a usage focus. We've said this in several of the pieces of work we've done. We've lobbied on this for a while. I'm positive that that's now beginning to see itself in the the recommendations of the Goldacre review. We talked about the data controlling bodies. The last slide was a very ambitious, a challenging recommendation by Ben Goldacre's report, which talks about how to change data controllership fundamentally. Whether that's going to be picked up or not, we don't know. But it's now picked up on the concerns that we've raised and embedded those within recommendations for government policy. And equally, we've always had concerns about data silos which exist, data pots which exist within organizations who don't share them, who don't make them available, are not open about them. So it's positive that TREs, the implementation of trusted research environments, will reduce some of that. But equally, we've still got concerns which I don't think are addressed yet around how many of these TREs are going to exist. And if we just replace current data silos with new TREs, we'll not have moved much further forward. So those are some points that we've picked up from our own statements and recommendations. Similarly, we've got our own clear transparency principles. And I thought it was worth noting on this that if you read through parts of the report, there are some quite open statements in there about some poor practices for research and for data management. And I thought it was quite good to see in a report such as this, because often those don't get highlighted. So there are some bits of bad news in the report, and our transparency principles clearly say we need to be clear on bad news as well as good news. And it was good to see that the report actually followed that philosophy. I think that's positive, worth mentioning. The key points are the last two. What wasn't in the report and what's needed is something to define what good PPI is. So the report is heavily technical. It talks about what a good TRE looks like, how to do TREs, how to embed new standards and practices around TREs, how to embed new technology areas, coding, sharing, and other things. What it doesn't do is describe what a good PPI is, what good involvement of patients, the public is, to make sure this is going to be designed properly, implemented properly, and working properly in a way which is open and transparent. So I think there's a lot of work being done around data and data trusts and trusted research environments, but nothing really about trust from our perspective around how you use the patient voice to get inside all this, to make sure that what's happening is developed in a trustworthy manner and can then engender trust in the wider public. So that was the most serious omission from the report. Very unclear about what that is. So my final slide is around, well, what are the takeaway points from this? And again, the blue is a quotation from the report itself, which does correctly highlight that if we just carry on doing what we're doing at the minute, there's a massive, which is hidden cost of duplication. Lots of things being repeated, outdated working methods, which means people don't share. We reinvent all the time. We're wasting time, energy, and effort. Data access monopolies will exist and continue to exist. We will continue to have needless risk around sending the same copy of data to lots of different places, and we can reduce that significantly. And we'll have missed the opportunities that this now brings with a heavy focus on what data can do for you after the pandemic. And I think this has clearly been informed by the pandemic, which was able to pull data together, use it very quickly to drive research and improve outcomes during and beyond the pandemic. So I think the key takeaway point is that Ben has recognized that. It's a welcome report. There are some good things in there. By and large, this is really positive, I think. There's some key recommendations in there which are really important, but that's hidden amongst 185 other recommendations. And I think we'd have to be careful to make sure that those, because of the 185, some of them don't get missed, or the important ones don't get missed. Trying to track the implementation of 6 recommendations, that's manageable. 185, that's going to take some effort. And I've seen in the past where recommendations within reports tend to get forgotten because there are lots of recommendations and some just get missed. It's also unclear how this gets taken forward. So this was a report, a review which was designed to inform the new national data strategy. We've seen the data strategy in draft and we commented on it. So we're now waiting for the final publication of the data strategy. And at that point, we'll know how many of these recommendations are being taken forward and will actually be implemented as policy rather than just being seen as recommendations and nice to have. My last take-home message is the key one. It was heavily focused on this is a highly technically focused report, but it hasn't picked up on anything to do with hearts and minds, the patients, the public. How do people feel about this? Are we embedded in this? Are we comfortable with it? Have we got enough say in how all this is designed and delivered? And to that last point, the involvement of patients really isn't clear in this. And collective, I think our biggest challenge is going to be defining what we think our part is in this. And again, that's a key role for all of us on Use My Data collectively.